He was a 50-year-old veteran who believed disappearing was the only way to survive. With nothing left but an aging German shepherd and a past that refused to stay buried, he spent $100 on an abandoned house deep in the winter mountains. Convinced that distance could quiet the memories, he didn't come looking for purpose. He came looking for silence. But the moment he arrived, something felt wrong. The snow was too still. The forest too watchful. His old dog froze, ears snapping forward, a low growl rising from deep in his chest. And then Garrick saw it on the porch of the house, meant to save him. A young woman hung suspended, bound, terrified, left for the cold to finish what others had started. She was only 23. A reporter who had asked the wrong questions. And this house was not abandoned by accident. He came seeking peace. What he found was a life hanging by a thread, a trail of secrets hidden in rotting walls, and a choice that would pull him back into danger. He thought he had escaped forever. Before we begin, please consider subscribing. Your support helps stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles reach those who need them most. God bless you for watching and for keeping hope alive. Snow fell lightly over the high plateau near Lake Chelan, Washington. The kind of quiet snowfall that erased sound and softened edges, turning roads into pale scars and forests into shadowed walls, as if winter itself were asking the world to speak more carefully. Garrick Morrow arrived just before dusk, steering his aging pickup along the last narrow stretch of mountain road with both hands locked on the wheel. At 50, his body still carried the outline of strength. Broad shoulders beneath a worn canvas jacket, thick forearms corded with old muscle. But everything about the way he moved suggested restraint rather than power. He did nothing quickly anymore. Every motion was measured economical, as if his body kept a ledger of pain and demanded payment for every unnecessary effort. His beard was dense and dark, with streaks of iron gray trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, framing a jawline marked by old tension. His face bore sharp angles, softened by fatigue, the skin weathered pale from months spent indoors and years spent under foreign suns. His eyes, a flat steel blue, rarely lingered on anything for long. Not from disinterest, but from a learned instinct to scan, assess, and move on before memories had time to form. The city had not chased him away. Garrick had simply faded from it. After the war, after the noise and the purpose collapsed into silence, he discovered that people expected explanations he could not give without unraveling himself in public. So, he learned how to shrink. He worked jobs that asked little and offered less repairs, hauling seasonal labor, never staying long enough to become familiar. The $100 house was not a dream. It was an exit, a seized property no one wanted deep enough into the mountains that winter claimed it early and released it late. No neighbors, no questions, just distance. Beside him sat Bronte, his German shepherd, 7 years old and visibly past his prime, but far from broken. The dog's coat was thick and coarse black along the back, with warm brown flooding his legs and face, dusted now with snowflakes melting slowly into the fur. His muzzle had begun to silver, especially around the eyes, giving him a look of permanent seriousness. Bronte's ears stood tall and alert, despite the cold rotating subtly, as if tuning into signals Garrick could not hear. His eyes, amber-sharp, unblinking, tracked the dark line of forest ahead with a quiet intelligence that came not from curiosity, but from training and long habit. Bronte had been a working dog once, disciplined and precise, taught to read danger before it announced itself. Age had stiffened his hips and slowed his stride, but nothing had dulled his vigilance. He leaned slightly toward Garrick as the truck slowed, a subtle reminder that he was still there, still watching. The house appeared suddenly through the trees, squat and sagging. Its roof bowed under the weight of snow. Time had stripped the wood of color, leaving the walls a dull gray that blended into the winter landscape like a thing already half forgotten. One window was shattered, another boarded unevenly. The porch leaned its railing missing sections as if torn away by years of neglect or desperate hands. Garrick cut the engine and sat for a moment listening to the sudden silence. No wind, no birds, just the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant hush of falling snow. "This is it," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Bront or himself. They stepped out together. The cold bit hard, sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Garrick's boots sank into the fresh snow as he crossed the porch, each step producing a hollow creak beneath his weight. Bront moved ahead. Nose low, tail steady but rigid, his posture alert without aggression. Garrick unlocked the door with a key that felt too small for what it represented. When he pushed it open, the hinges complained in a long, strained groan that echoed inside the house like a warning given too late. The air inside was stale and dry, carrying the faint smell of rot and old dust. Light filtered weakly through the broken window, revealing a living room stripped of comfort, bare floorboards. A collapsed chair in one corner, a fireplace choked with ash and debris. Wind threaded through unseen cracks, producing a thin, uneven whistle that rose and fell like breathing. Garrick paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room out of habit more than fear. He had expected rodents, maybe a raccoon. He had not expected Bront to stop. The dog froze mid-step. His ears snapped forward. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud, not frantic, but deliberate and controlled. Bront's eyes locked onto something deeper in the room. His body angled protectively without blocking Garrick's path. Garrick felt the familiar tightening behind his ribs, the instinct that never fully left him, the one that whispered, this place was not empty in the way he had hoped. "Easy," Garrick said quietly, though his own heart had begun to accelerate. His gaze followed Bront's line of sight. At first, his mind refused to assemble what he was seeing. It was just a shape darker than the shadows suspended awkwardly where nothing should have been. Then his eyes adjusted. A pair of women's boots hung a few inches above the floor, their soles dusted white with tracked-in snow. Garrick's breath caught sharply, a sound he hadn't made in years. He raised his eyes slowly, unwillingly. A young woman hung from a rope tied to the main support beam, her body, slack head tilted forward so that dark hair spilled over her face. Snow clung to her coat and lashes already melting into damp streaks against pale skin. Her cheeks were mottled with bruises, one eye swollen nearly shut. Her chest rose and fell so faintly that it was almost impossible to tell whether she was breathing at all. For a heartbeat, Garrick could not move. The room narrowed, sound dimming as memory surged forward uninvited. The war had taught him many things, but one lesson had carved itself deeper than the rest. Hesitation cost lives. His body remembered even when his mind faltered. He lunged forward, boots skidding on the floorboards, fingers numb as he fumbled for the knife clipped inside his jacket. Bront barked once, sharp and urgent, circling beneath the hanging body, his movements frantic but purposeful. Garrick sawed through the rope with brutal efficiency. The fibers resisted, frozen stiff, and then gave way. The woman collapsed into his arms with a weight that felt wrong, not heavy, not light, but empty, as if the cold had already begun to claim her. Garrick staggered back, nearly losing his footing, then lowered her carefully to the floor. Up close, she looked impossibly young. 23 maybe. Her frame was slender, her limbs long and awkward in the way of someone not yet finished growing into herself. Her skin was pale beneath the bruising, freckled lightly across the bridge of her nose. Her hair, chestnut brown and thick, clung in frozen strands to her temples. Her lips were blue, cracked, barely parted. Bront pressed himself against her side without command, his body radiating warmth, a low whine vibrating in his throat. Garrick shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, then checked her wrists. Rope burns circled them angrily, skin broken and swollen. His jaw tightened. He had seen cruelty before. He had never grown accustomed to it. "Stay with me," he he muttered, though he did not know whether she could hear him. He scooped her up again, ignoring the flare of pain in his shoulder, and carried her toward the fireplace. His movements were steady now, controlled by a focus that felt almost foreign after years of withdrawal. He laid her down near the hearth and began rubbing her hands between his own counting breaths, watching for any sign of response. Bront stayed close, his amber eyes flicking constantly between the door and the woman's face, his growl fading into a tense, watchful silence. A faint sound escaped her throat, barely more than a breath. Her eyelids fluttered. Garrick leaned closer, his heart hammering with a hope he did not want to name. One eye opened hazel, an unfocused fear flickering briefly before exhaustion pulled it closed again. "You're inside," Garrick said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "You're alive." He did not yet know her name. He did not know why she had been brought here or who had decided Winter would finish the work. He only knew that the promise he had made to himself to disappear, to stay untouched by the world's violence, had ended the moment he cut that rope. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent and patient, while inside the $100 house, a life hovered on the thin edge between silence and survival. The fire took time to catch. Garrick fed it patiently, splitting damp wood with practiced force, coaxing flame from stubborn kindling, while the house groaned around them. The kitchen was little more than a narrow room off the main living space, its cabinets warped, its sink rust-stained, but it was shielded from the worst of the wind. Snow hissed softly as it melted near the hearth, releasing a sharp mineral smell into the air. Bront lay pressed against the young woman's side, his thick body curved protectively around her torso, rising and falling with a steady rhythm meant to lend her warmth and life by proximity alone. The girl's eyelids fluttered again. This time they stayed open. Her eyes were hazel-flecked, faintly with green sharp, even through the fog of cold and pain. She stared at Garrick as if trying to assemble him from fragments, the beard threaded with gray, the heavy coat dusted white, the eyes too calm for a stranger in a moment like this. Her lips trembled, then parted. The sound that emerged was thin but deliberate. "Elowyn," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the name, not from emotion, but from cold. "Elowyn Sutter." Garrick nodded once, acknowledging it as if names mattered more than explanations right now. "You're safe for the moment," he said quietly. His voice was low, gravel-edged, shaped by years of giving orders that could not afford panic. "Don't try to move yet." She swallowed her throat, working painfully. Up close, Garrick could see that she was younger than he had first thought, no older than 23. Her face was narrow, her cheekbones sharp beneath the bruising, giving her a look of brittle resilience. Her hair, chestnut brown and naturally thick, had escaped its tie and hung loose damp from melting snow. Her skin was pale, not sickly, but winter fair, freckled lightly across her nose and upper cheeks. There was something composed about her, even now a restraint in the way she held herself, despite the tremor running through her limbs. Bront lifted his head slightly when she shifted, his amber eyes locking onto her face. When she noticed him, tension flashed across her features, then eased. She reached out weakly, her fingers brushing his fur. Bront responded with a low, steady huff, his tail thumping once against the floor, a sound as reassuring as any spoken promise. "Journalist," she said after a moment, as if answering a question Garrick had not yet asked. "Local paper. Freelance mostly." Garrick paused in his work, glancing at her more closely now. The word explained some things. The calm beneath fear. The way her gaze kept returning to the room, cataloging details, even as her body struggled to survive. "What were you doing here?" he asked. Elowyn's jaw tightened. She drew a shallow breath, then another, building strength before speaking. "Investigating," she said. "Disappearances. People who slipped through the cracks." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the dark window, then back to Garrick. "They don't all vanish the same way. Some freeze, some fall, some hang. Always in winter. Always near seized properties. The words landed with weight. Garrick leaned back against the counter, arms folded loosely across his chest, listening without interrupting. His posture was relaxed, but his attention sharpened, the old soldier in him waking fully now. Brant's ears twitched at the shift in Garrick's tone, his body angling subtly toward the door. They make it look like accidents. Elowen continued, her voice steadier now that she had started. Like people who wandered where they shouldn't have. Or gave up. Her mouth curved briefly humorless. Winter is convenient. It erases things. Garrick felt a familiar heat coil low in his chest, slow and controlled. He had seen that logic before in other places, under other flags. Violence disguised as inevitability. "And you?" he asked. "What did you find?" Elowen hesitated. Not from fear of him, Garrick realized, but from the weight of choosing what to reveal first. "Patterns," she said finally. "Properties seized fast. Paperwork rushed through. Names that repeat across different cases. Clerks, inspectors, contractors. People who never appear in the same place twice on record, but always nearby." Her fingers curled against Brant's fur. "I followed one lead too far. Someone noticed." She closed her eyes briefly, the memory tightening her features. When she opened them again, there was no hysteria there, only anger held in check. "They grabbed me 2 nights ago, told me to stop asking questions. When I didn't, they brought me here." Garrick exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked around the kitchen again, seeing it differently now, not as a refuge he had bought with his last dollars, but as a stage already marked by prior cruelty. This house, he said more to himself than to her. "It's been used before." Elowen nodded once. "Yes." The confirmation settled heavily between them. Garrick straightened his movements, unhurried but purposeful. He fetched a blanket from the truck and layered it over her, then returned to the fire, adjusting it until the heat spread more evenly. Brant did not move from her side. Outside, the light had faded entirely, leaving the world beyond the windows a flat, shifting gray. Snow continued to fall thicker now, each flake softening sound and sight alike. "There are records," Elowen said after a while. "Proof. I didn't bring them all with me." She watched Garrick closely as she spoke, gauging his reaction. "I hid some before they took me. Not here." Her eyes flicked to the walls, then away. "Somewhere close." "I didn't know you'd buy the house." "I didn't know either," Garrick replied. There was no bitterness in his tone, only acceptance. He rubbed a hand over his beard, feeling the familiar rasp of it beneath his fingers. "You planning to go to the police?" A faint, tired smile touched her mouth. "Eventually. But not yet. Not until I know who I can trust." Garrick considered that. Trust had become a scarce resource in his life as well. "You shouldn't stay here," he said. "Once they realize you're alive, they'll come back." Elowen's gaze hardened. "I know." Silence settled again, thicker this time, layered with implication. Brant shifted, rising to his feet and pacing once around the kitchen before stopping near the doorway. A low growl rolled through his chest, barely audible, but insistent. Garrick's head lifted immediately. "What is it?" he murmured. Brant's ears were pinned forward, his body tense, nose working the air. He was not panicking. He was tracking. Garrick moved closer to the door, listening. At first, there was nothing but wind and the soft percussion of falling snow. Then faintly beneath it all came a sound that did not belong, the metal contracting. Or perhaps the distant echo of an engine idling too far away to be seen. Elowen noticed the change in Garrick's posture, the way his shoulders loosened, even as his stance became more deliberate. "They're coming back," she said quietly. It was not a question. Maybe, Garrick replied. Or maybe they're checking. He did not reach for a weapon. He had none within easy reach anyway. Instead, He rested a steadying hand on Brant's shoulder, grounding the dog without restraining him. "We'll keep the lights low," he said, "and we won't panic." Elowen nodded, drawing the blanket tighter around herself. Despite the fear flickering behind her eyes, she did not argue. That Garrick noted was telling. She was not reckless. She was methodical. Whatever had led her here had not been carelessness, but persistence. Minutes passed. The sound outside did not grow closer. Eventually, Brant's growl faded. His posture easing slightly, though he remained alert, Garrick did not relax. He had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself twice. He crouched beside Elowen again. "If we get you out of here," he said, choosing his words carefully, "this won't end. Not for you, and not for me." She met his gaze steadily. "I know," she said, "but if I stop now, it doesn't end for anyone else either." Something in her tone, quiet, unyielding, struck Garrick deeper than he expected. He saw suddenly the person she had been before the rope and the cold. Not fearless, not naive, simply unwilling to look away. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the loose boards of the house like restless fingers. Garrick looked around the kitchen one last time at the firelight dancing across cracked walls, at the old dog standing guard, at the young woman wrapped in borrowed warmth. The promise he had made when he bought the house to disappear, to remain untouched, felt distant now, almost absurd. This place had not been empty when he arrived, and it would not let him leave unchanged. The night tightened around the house, as if winter itself had leaned closer to listen. Snow no longer drifted gently. It fell in dense sheets driven sideways by wind that struck the roof with open-handed force. The old structure answered with groans and sharp cracks, each sound carrying through the walls like a warning. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, its light stretching long shadows across the living room floor, turning every corner into a place where something might be waiting. Brant refused to rest. The German shepherd rose from his place near Elowen and began pacing, his movements slow but deliberate, nails clicking softly against the warped floorboards. His black and brown coat rippled over muscle that age had stiffened but not weakened. His tail stayed low, rigid, and his ears remained fully upright, swiveling with an intensity that spoke of focus rather than fear. Garrick watched him from across the room, recognizing the pattern immediately. This was not anxiety. This was detection. "Something's wrong," Garrick murmured, more statement than question. Brant completed another circuit of the room, then stopped abruptly near the far wall. One Garrick had barely glanced at before. Wooden planks nailed crudely over what might once have been a window or doorway formed a patchwork barrier darker than the surrounding walls. Brant pressed his nose close to the wood, inhaling deeply, then let out a low growl that vibrated through his chest like a held breath. He pawed once at the boards, careful but insistent. Elowen shifted on the mattress Garrick had dragged closer to the fire. Color had returned faintly to her cheeks, though she still looked fragile, wrapped in layers of borrowed clothing. Her hazel eyes sharpened as she followed Brant's attention. "He's found something," she said quietly. Garrick nodded. He crossed the room, every step measured, the old instincts aligning seamlessly with the present moment. He ran his hand along the planks. They were newer than the rest of the house, the wood less weathered, the nails less rusted. Not recent, but not original either. Someone had sealed this section intentionally. He fetched the pry bar from his tool bag and wedged it carefully between two boards. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a sharp crack that echoed louder than it should have. Brant stepped back, watching intently, his amber eyes never leaving the widening gap. Garrick worked methodically, levering each plank free, stacking them aside without noise or haste. Behind the boards was not insulation or framing, but empty space, a narrow cavity built into the wall. Garrick leaned closer, angling his flashlight into the darkness. Something glinted faintly in the beam. He reached in and drew out a compact bundle, wrapped tightly in black plastic, sealed with duct tape, and layered with care. The weight of it was modest, but its presence felt heavy. Elowen sat upright, despite Garrick's earlier instructions, her breath catching. "That's not mine," she said immediately. Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched in the blanket. "I didn't hide anything here." Garrick did not answer right away. He peeled back the plastic, slowly revealing its contents, with the caution of a man who understood that truth once exposed could not be returned to darkness. Inside were several items, a pair of flash drives neatly labeled with dates, folded printouts of emails and scanned documents, a small handheld recorder, and a handful of photographs printed on cheap matte paper. The images showed people Garrick did not recognize, men standing near trucks, women entering offices, hands exchanging envelopes captured from angles meant to avoid notice. Elowen's face drained of what little color it had regained. "That means—" She trailed off, then finished quietly. "Someone else was investigating. Someone before me." Garrick looked at her, then really looked. The realization settling in her eyes was not fear alone, but grief layered with anger. These were not abstract victims anymore. They were colleagues, strangers bound by the same choice to look closer when walking away would have been easier. Bront moved closer to Elowen, positioning himself between her and the exposed wall, his body angled protectively. He did not growl now. He watched. Garrick scanned the documents quickly, not reading every word, but noting patterns the way he had once read terrain maps. Names repeated, properties listed and relisted, dates that overlapped too neatly. This was not one reporter's work. It was a chain. Each person had added something before being forced into silence. The house was not just a trap. It was a repository, a place chosen deliberately to hold the pieces others had not lived long enough to assemble. "They used this place as an endpoint," Garrick said slowly, "and someone used it as a drop." Elowen swallowed, like a dead man's handoff. Yes. The wind struck the house again, harder this time, rattling the loose boards they had not yet repaired. Snow forced its way through the broken window, dusting the floor near the door. Garrick rewrapped the bundle, carefully sealing it as he'd found it, then tucked it into his pack. The decision settled in him without ceremony. "If I take you out of here," he said, "they'll keep hunting you. If I keep this—" He did not finish the sentence. Elowen met his gaze. "Then they'll hunt you too." A corner of Garrick's mouth tightened, not quite a smile. "I'm used to that." She studied him. Really studied him now, the way his shoulders squared unconsciously, the way his eyes tracked sound and space, the faint tremor in his right hand when he'd forced it to work too long. "You didn't plan to get involved?" she said. "No," Garrick replied. "I planned to disappear." Bront shifted his weight, pressing briefly against Garrick's leg, as if reminding him that plans once broken could still be reshaped. They did not hear the vehicle at first. The storm masked its approach, swallowing sound and distance alike. It was Bront who noticed the slightest change in the rhythm of the night, a vibration too steady to be wind. His head snapped toward the window, ears rigid, body going utterly still. Garrick extinguished the lantern without being told. Darkness flooded the room, broken only by the dim orange pulse of embers in the fireplace. He guided Elowen down to the floor behind the kitchen counter, keeping his movements slow and quiet. Bront positioned himself near the front door, broad chest squared, his silhouette barely visible, but unmistakably solid. Headlights swept faintly through the trees outside, then disappeared. An engine idled somewhere beyond the clearing, low and patient. Garrick counted seconds in his head, mapping distance, imagining angles of approach. The men who had done this would not rush. They would confirm. Elowen's breath came shallow but controlled. She did not cry. She did not speak. Her fingers curled into the fabric of Garrick's jacket where he had draped it over her shoulders. Trust, he realized, could form very quickly when options ran out. Footsteps crunched in the snow. One set, then another. Garrick recognized the cadence immediately, men confident enough to be careless, accustomed to being obeyed. A shadow passed the window, followed by the soft scrape of something metallic against wood. Bront growled low and warning. The door handle rattled once testing. A voice murmured something Garrick could not make out. Another answered, irritated, impatient. Garrick's body aligned instinctively, weight-balanced muscles ready. He did not need a weapon to know where to stand. The handle moved again harder this time. Bront lunged forward in a controlled burst, slamming his weight against the door from the inside, barking loud and fierce. The sound shattered the night's quiet, echoing into the trees. Garrick stepped in behind him, his voice cutting through the chaos. Back away. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke with the authority of someone who had enforced lines before and expected them to be respected. For a moment, there was only wind and barking and the muffled exchange of hurried words outside. Then the footsteps retreated. The engine revved. Headlights flared briefly through the branches before vanishing down the road. Silence returned, heavier than before. Bront held his position long after the sound faded, body rigid, ears forward. Only when Garrick rested a hand on his shoulder did he ease slightly, though he did not relax. Elwyn exhaled shakily. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes," Garrick agreed. "But not tonight." He looked around the room. The torn wall. The hidden evidence now gone. The young woman pulled back from death, the old dog still standing guard. The house was no longer just a shelter or a crime scene. It was a line he had crossed. Responsibility, long dormant, had woken fully now. Dawn came reluctantly, the sky still bruised blue-black, as snow fell in long slanted veils that blurred distance and swallowed sound. Headlights swept across the pine trunks in slow, deliberate arcs. Not lost, not passing through. Coming back to finish what Winter had been asked to do. Garrick did not hesitate. He extinguished the remaining embers in the fireplace with a scatter of snow plunging the house into near-total darkness. His movements were quiet, practiced, the kind shaped by years of learning how to exist without being seen. He guided Elwyn toward the narrow hatch beneath the kitchen floor, a cold storage cellar once used for root vegetables and meat. The space was cramped and damp, the earth walls smelling of old soil and iron, but it was hidden. Elwyn moved slowly, her body still weak, but her resolve intact. Her face was pale freckles, standing out sharply against the cold chestnut hair, tucked into a knit cap Garrick had found. Her hazel eyes flicked up to him once steady, despite the fear threading through her breath. "I'm okay," she whispered, not to reassure him, but to anchor herself. Bront took position at the front door. The German shepherd's broad chest filled the space like a living barricade. His lips curled back slightly, teeth visible, breath coming in low, forceful bursts that fogged the air. The silver along his muzzle caught what little light remained, making him look older, heavier, but no less formidable. Garrick rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck, feeling the solid warmth beneath fur and skin, then closed the cellar hatch above Elwyn, leaving just enough space for air. The door rattled. A gloved hand tested the handle, slow and methodical. Then a voicemail, low, stripped of warmth, slipped through the wood. "Check it again." "Don't rush." Another voice answered, sharper, impatient. "It's a dump. No one stays out here." The lock gave way with a muted crack. Footsteps entered. Crunching snow tracked across the floorboards. Garrick pressed himself into the shadow near the back of the kitchen, muscles coiled, heart steady in his chest. The smell of cold air, gasoline, and damp wool filled the house. One of the men moved deeper inside, boots heavy, careless. Another lingered near the door. Bront growled. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The sound carried intent, a promise without theatrics. A curse followed. Someone laughed nervously. "Just a dog," the sharper voice said. "Old one by the look of it." Bront lunged forward just enough to make his presence undeniable, barking once fierce and sudden. The sound echoed off the walls off the rot, and the exposed beams magnified by the small space. Garrick seized the moment. He reached back and shoved the loose plank he had positioned earlier, letting it crash down the back steps and into the snow outside. The noise was sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Back there, someone shouted. Footsteps split. One man bolted toward the rear door. Another followed, boots pounding, breath ragged. Garrick waited only long enough to be certain the house was no longer fully occupied. He moved quickly, then lifting the cellar hatch and pulling Elowen up with careful urgency. She swayed once, then, steady, jaw clenched against pain and cold. Now, Garrick murmured. They slipped out through the side window Garrick had loosened earlier, dropping into snow that came nearly to Elowen's knees. Garrick angled his body to shield her from the worst of the wind. One arm braced around her back. Bront moved ahead, nose low, choosing a path Garrick trusted without question. They ran. The frozen creek cut through the forest like a pale scar. Its surface glazed with ice, thick enough to hold weight, but treacherous at the edges. Garrick guided Elowen onto it carefully, boots sliding as he adjusted his pace to match hers. The sky lightened incrementally, dawn bleeding into the treetops, just enough to reveal shapes without fully exposing them. Breath tore at Garrick's lungs. Old injuries flaring hot and sharp, but he did not slow. Stopping meant freezing. Freezing meant silence. Behind them, voices rose, shouts fractured by wind. The crack of a branch snapping under hurried boots. A beam of light skimmed across the snow, missing them by yards, but close enough to quicken Garrick's pulse. Bront darted ahead, then paused, circling back to nudge Elowen's leg when she faltered his flank, brushing hers in silent encouragement. A sharp yelp cut the air. Bront stumbled, skidding on ice. Garrick turned just in time to see the dog catch himself, blood darkening the fur along his right hip where jagged ice had torn skin. The wound was shallow, but ugly red against white. Bront shook once, then pressed on, refusing to slow. "I'm fine," Garrick growled, though no one had asked. He was speaking as much to himself as to the dog. They left the creek and plunged back into the trees as the sun finally crested the ridge, a weak disk behind cloud cover. Snow fell more gently now, deceptive in its beauty. By midday, the wind returned stronger, carrying the forest's mocking laughter in every gust. Garrick's legs burned. Elowen's steps shortened, her breath hitching despite her stubborn refusal to stop. By late afternoon, they reached the abandoned ranger station. The structure crouched against the slope, half buried in drifted snow, its metal door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was colder than the open forest, but mercifully still. Old maps peeled from the walls. A desk lay, overturned drawers spilled and empty. Garrick barred the door with a length of pipe and eased Elowen down behind a stack of crates. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound Bront's wound hand, steady movements precise. The dog endured it without complaint, amber eyes never leaving the entrance. They waited. Hours stretched thin, bending and folding in on themselves. The storm rose and fell, like a living thing testing the walls, searching for gaps. Garrick listened with every sense he had left, counting heartbeats between gusts, separating the sounds of weather from those that carried intention. Elowen stayed quiet, conserving strength, watching Garrick's face for cues. There was fear in her eyes. Yes, but also something else, trust born not of comfort, but of shared danger. As night settled again, lights appeared through the snow. Not one vehicle, several. Voices followed, louder this time, carrying authority that did not bother to whisper. Orders, names, the unmistakable cadence of coordination. Garrick felt the tension drain from his shoulders in slow increments. He did not relax, but he allowed himself to breathe. The door banged open, cold flooding in, and figures in heavy coats moved past them without pause. Uniforms dusted with snow. faces set in grim focus. One man stopped briefly, his gaze flicking to Garrick. He was in his late 40s, tall, broad through the shoulders, his beard trimmed, close eyes lined by years of sleepless nights. A county sheriff, Garrick guessed. The man's look lingered just long enough to register recognition, not of Garrick himself, but of the posture, the readiness, the quiet competence. "We've got them," the sheriff said simply, nodding once before moving on. Outside, raised voices cut through the storm. Protests, the clink of cuffs, engines idling, then cutting. Bront struggled to his feet, favoring his injured side for a moment before planting himself solidly again, tail giving a single tired sweep. When it was safe, Garrick helped Elowen stand. She was shaking exhaustion, finally claiming its due, but she was upright. Alive. As they stepped back into the open, the storm eased, leaving the world reshaped, quiet, bright, aching. The men who had hunted them were led away, swallowed by headlights and falling snow. Garrick looked at the forest, then at the ranger station, then down at Bront, leaning against his leg like an anchor. He understood with a clarity that surprised him that the choice he had made back at the house could not be undone. The chase was over. What came next would be something else entirely. Winter did not leave all at once. It loosened its grip, gradually releasing the mountains in careful stages, as if testing whether the land could be trusted again. The storms retreated first, then the night softened, and finally the light began to linger a few minutes longer at the edges of each day. Snow still covered the clearing around the house, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a memory that had begun to thaw. The men responsible for what had happened were taken quietly. There were no dramatic headlines. At first, no flashing cameras in the mountains. Justice moved the way it often did in places far from crowds, slow, deliberate, undeniable. The chain of evidence spoke when people tried not to. Flash drives yielded files that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Audio recordings captured voices that had never expected to be heard outside closed rooms. Photographs tied names to places, places to actions, actions to outcomes. And Elowen Sutter's testimony, calm and unflinching, closed the gaps the paper trail could not. Garrick Morrow did not attend the hearings. He watched from a distance, reading summaries when they were published, listening when Elowen called with updates. He had spent most of his adult life learning how to disappear, how to let the world move past him without friction. He had assumed that once the danger passed, he would return to that shape. But standing in the doorway of the house he had bought for $100, watching Bront sleep with his chin resting on the threshold, Garrick understood that something essential had shifted. Bront's breathing was rougher now, his chest rising and falling, with a faint rattle left behind by cold nights and a body that had been pushed too hard for too long. The German shepherd's muzzle had gone almost entirely silver, the amber in his eyes softened by age, but not dulled. He slept deeply these days, stretched out where he could feel the movement of the house and the open air at once. Even in rest he guarded. Garrick found himself adjusting his routines around the dog without thinking, waking earlier to give Bront time to rise, working in shorter bursts, keeping the fire lit longer at night. Elowen returned when the roads became passable again. She did not arrive as someone seeking refuge. She arrived with purpose. Her wrists still bore faint marks where rope had once burned skin, pale scars that caught the light when she moved. She stood straighter than before, her slender frame wrapped in a heavy coat, chestnut hair, worn loose, now brushing her shoulders. The winter had taken something from her, but it had also given her clarity. Her hazel eyes missed very little. "I'm done running," she said on her first morning back, standing beside Garrick in the clearing. There was no defiance in her tone, only resolve, shaped by survival. Garrick nodded. "So am I." They did not talk much about what had happened, not because it was forbidden, but because neither of them needed repetition to understand the cost. Instead, they worked. Garrick repaired the roof first, replacing warped shingles and reinforcing beams weakened by years of neglect. His right shoulder protested, sending sharp reminders through his arm, but he worked around the pain, adapting rather than forcing. The habits of endurance he had learned in uniform found a new purpose here, one that did not demand silence in the face of suffering. He mended the porch, replaced broken windows, sealed the walls against wind that had once carried whispers of violence through the rooms. The gate took longer. It had stood for years as a crude wooden arch, its beams scarred by rope marks and weather leaning slightly, as if ashamed of what it had held. Garrick dismantled it carefully, laying each piece on the ground as though handling remains. He sanded the splintered wood, replaced the cracked beam entirely, and reset the posts so they stood straight and firm. When he raised the gate again, it no longer creaked like a warning. It opened wide and clean, an entrance rather than a sentence. Elowen watched the work closely, not interfering but noticing. She had always been that way, Garrick realized, observant, without intrusion. In the afternoons, she spread papers across the kitchen table, organizing timelines and names, turning chaos into narrative. Her writing was precise, her language restrained, shaped by respect for the people whose lives had intersected with the house. When she spoke to families who had lost someone to winter, in silence she listened more than she talked. That more than her questions earned trust. People began to come. At first, they arrived cautiously. A middle-aged woman named Maribel Cross, small and wiry with prematurely gray hair, pulled back in a tight braid and hands roughened by factory work, came looking for a place to rest after weeks of sleeping in her car. She spoke little, her eyes constantly measuring exits, but she accepted a bowl of soup and a chair by the fire without suspicion. She stayed 2 nights, then left a folded note of thanks beneath a mug, returning once a week afterward to check in. Later came Ethan Rowe, a quiet man in his early 30s, with a narrow face, unshaven jaw, and eyes that avoided mirrors. He had lost his job and his apartment within the same month and carried his possessions in a frayed backpack. Garrick showed him how to split wood properly, correcting his grip without words. Ethan learned quickly. He stayed long enough to remember how it felt to wake up without fear, then moved on with a direction he had not had before. The house did not become a shelter in the formal sense. There were no rules posted, no questions demanded. It became something quieter, a place where people could stop long enough to breathe, to warm themselves, to remember who they were, before everything narrowed. Bront claimed the porch as his domain. He lay in the sun when it appeared, lifting his ashen his head whenever footsteps approached, tail thumping once in recognition before settling again. Children learned quickly that he was gentle but attentive, a presence that discouraged harm without needing to announce it. The thin scar along his right hip healed cleanly, disappearing beneath fur, though he favored the side when rising on cold mornings. Garrick noticed. He adjusted the steps accordingly. On one late afternoon, as light stretched thin and gold across the clearing, Garrick stood at the gate and watched the shadows move. The past had not vanished. He did not expect it to. Memories still came unbidden, especially at night when the fire burned low and the mountains held their breath. But they no longer owned him. He had learned something he had forgotten how to name. Responsibility freely chosen was different from orders obeyed. It did not diminish him. It anchored him. Elowen joined him, resting a gloved hand on the rebuilt post. Up close, she looked younger than her experiences suggested, but there was a steadiness in her posture that spoke of resilience rather than hardness. "The story's running tomorrow," she said. "Not sensational, just honest." "That's enough," Garrick replied. They stood together without speaking, Bront settling between them, solid and warm. The gate stood open, not because danger no longer existed, but because fear no longer ruled the threshold. The house that had once been used to end lives now marked beginnings that did not need permission. Garrick did not consider himself redeemed. He did not seek forgiveness from the mountains or from history. He simply stayed. He fixed what was broken. He listened when people spoke. And when night came, he locked the door not out of dread, but out of care. The $100 house remained what it had always been in structure, imperfect, bearing scars. But meaning, Garrick understood at last, was not inherent. It was chosen, rebuilt beam by beam, act by act, until even a place meant for erasure could become a threshold for return. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or blinding light. They arrive quietly disguised as endurance. As a man who thought his life was finished, a young woman who refused to stop telling the truth, and a loyal dog who never learned how to walk away. God did not erase their pain. He did something more lasting. He placed them together at the exact moment when giving up would have been easier than standing firm. In our everyday lives, many of us feel like Garrick once did, tired, invisible, carrying wounds no one else can see. Many feel like Elowin doing the right thing, yet paying a price that feels unfair. And some of us are like Bront, still standing guard even when our strength is fading. This story reminds us of a quiet truth. God is still working even when the world feels cold and silent. He sends help in unexpected forms. A stranger, a second chance, a loyal companion, or the courage to stay when running away would hurt less. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if you believe in stories of faith, resilience, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and become part of this community. May God bless you and your home. May He protect those you love, heal what has been broken, and guide your steps through every storm. And may His quiet miracles find you right when you need them most.